For decades, one particular image has appeared again and again in the art of the ancient world, carved into stone reliefs in the palaces of Assyrian kings, painted on the walls of Sumerian temples, and, according to a small but persistent group of alternative history writers, echoed in the art of civilizations, thousands of miles away and thousands of years apart. It looks, unmistakably, like a handbag. A rounded handle on top, a rectangular body below, carried casually in the hand of winged, non-human figures, standing beside gods and kings. For years, this image has been presented online as one of archaeology's great unsolved puzzles. Proof, some have claimed, of ancient contact between civilizations that supposedly never met, or evidence of something considerably stranger hiding in plain sight within humanity's oldest religious art. Here's what actual archaeologists and specialists in ancient Near Eastern iconography have to say about it, and why the real answer turns out to be both less mysterious and, in its own way, more interesting than the internet's favorite version of this story. Let's start with exactly where this image comes from, because understanding its original context is essential before getting into what it actually depicts. The most famous, most frequently reproduced examples of this handbag-shaped object come from Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs, stone carvings created roughly during the 9th century BC, excavated from royal palaces in what is now northern Iraq. In these reliefs, the object appears carried by winged, often eagle-headed or otherwise composite figures, protective divine beings that scholars specializing in ancient Mesopotamian religion identify as apkallu, a term that translates roughly to sages or wise ones. These weren't gods in the sense of primary deities like Marduk or Ishtar. They were considered semi-divine guardian spirits, protective figures believed to safeguard the king, the palace, and the broader cosmic order through ritual action, frequently depicted standing beside a stylized, elaborately rendered tree, an image scholars generally refer to as the sacred tree, itself a recurring, symbolically loaded motif throughout Mesopotamian royal art. In these carvings, the handbag-shaped object typically appears in one hand of the apkallu figure, while the other hand holds a smaller cone-shaped object, generally interpreted as representing the male flower of the date palm, which the figure appears to be dipping directly into the bucket-shaped vessel, apparently in preparation to sprinkle or apply whatever liquid the container holds. This is precisely the detail that leads directly to the actual scholarly identification of what this object really is, an identification considerably more grounded in genuine textual and archaeological evidence than the popular online mystery framing typically acknowledges. Specialists in Assyriology, the academic field dedicated to studying the ancient languages, texts, and material culture of Mesopotamia, have identified this object in the original Akkadian language texts themselves, under the specific term dalu, a word confirmed through surviving cuneiform inscriptions to be synonymous with another related term, bandudu, both of which refer directly to a bucket, specifically a bucket used for drawing water. This isn't a loose, speculative translation pieced together from indirect context. It's a direct textual identification, connecting the specific object depicted in these carvings to a specific named vessel type that ancient Assyrian scribes themselves wrote about and clearly understood as an ordinary, functional, everyday item, albeit one being used here within a formal ritual and religious context. What makes this identification particularly solid, rather than simply one plausible theory among several equally weighted alternatives, is that it doesn't rest on textual evidence alone. Archaeologists have actually recovered physical bronze buckets from Mesopotamian excavation sites that match the shape depicted in these carvings with striking precision. Curved bodies, arched carrying handles, proportions that align closely with the stylized two-dimensional renderings found throughout the palace reliefs. When a carved image, a written textual term, and an actual surviving physical artifact all converge on the same identification, that represents about as strong a form of archaeological confirmation as this particular field of study is generally able to produce. The object depicted in these Assyrian and Sumerian carvings is a ritual water bucket, most likely used specifically in ceremonies involving the symbolic watering or purification of the sacred tree motif these apkallu figures are so frequently depicted standing directly beside. It's worth pausing here to directly address why, despite this genuinely solid, multiply-corroborated archaeological identification, the handbag mystery framing has continued circulating so persistently and so widely online, because understanding that gap between scholarly consensus and popular perception is itself a genuinely interesting part of this story. Part of the explanation traces back to a specific, honest observation that alternative history writers have correctly identified, even if the conclusions they've subsequently drawn from it don't hold up under closer scrutiny. Sumerian religious and mythological texts, despite being remarkably extensive and detailed in many other respects, documenting elaborate creation myths, detailed ritual instructions, and extensive religious cosmology, don't appear to contain any direct, explicit written description specifically identifying or explaining this particular handbag-shaped object as it appears in Sumerian, as opposed to the later Assyrian artistic contexts specifically. This genuine gap between the frequency of the object's visual appearance and the absence of a specific accompanying Sumerian textual explanation has understandably fueled speculation over the years, since it's genuinely somewhat unusual for an object depicted this consistently and this frequently throughout religious art to lack a clear, explicit written explanation within the surviving textual record from that same specific culture and time period. However, and this is a genuinely important distinction that often gets lost in more sensationalized coverage of this topic, the absence of a specific Sumerian textual description doesn't mean the object itself remains genuinely unidentified or unexplained. It simply means that the clearest, most direct textual confirmation happens to come from the later Assyrian period rather than from the earlier Sumerian period specifically, a distinction that matters enormously for understanding ancient Mesopotamian history accurately. Since Sumerian and Assyrian, while both major Mesopotamian civilizations, connected through thousands of years of shared cultural development, geographic overlap, and evolving religious tradition, represent genuinely distinct cultures separated by well over 1,000 years of historical development. Given that the bucket identification is confirmed through Assyrian textual and archaeological evidence, and given the well-documented, extensive continuity of religious symbolism, artistic conventions, and ritual practice across the broader span of ancient Mesopotamian civilization more generally, the overwhelming scholarly consensus holds that the same object, serving essentially the same ritual purpose, appears consistently across both the earlier Sumerian and later Assyrian artistic traditions, even though the specific written confirmation of exactly what it represents happens to survive most clearly and most directly from the Assyrian textual record specifically. Now, to address the considerably more dramatic and considerably more widely circulated version of this story, the one suggesting this exact same handbag motif appears, in essentially identical form, across entirely unrelated civilizations spanning the globe, among the Maori of New Zealand, the Olmec of ancient Mesoamerica, and carved into the famous stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, one of the oldest known monumental structures ever built by human hands. This considerably broader, more sweeping claim has been popularized extensively through alternative history writers, most notably including Graham Hancock, whose book Magicians of the Gods draws direct visual comparisons between these various handbag-like motifs, suggesting they represent evidence of some kind of shared, possibly forgotten connection between ancient civilizations that mainstream archaeology insists never had any meaningful contact with one another. Here's where a genuinely important, careful, scholarly distinction needs to be drawn, one that separates legitimate archaeological inquiry from a considerably weaker, less rigorous style of pattern matching that characterizes much of this particular alternative history claim. Mainstream archaeologists and specialists in ancient iconography, the academic study of symbolic imagery across different cultures, do not treat the Mesopotamian ritual bucket, the various Mesoamerican basket or bag-shaped ceremonial objects found in Olmec and later Maya and Aztec art, and whatever specific shapes appear carved into the pillars at Göbekli Tepe as representing the same underlying object or symbol at all. This isn't scholarly stubbornness or an unwillingness to consider unconventional evidence. It reflects a fairly basic, genuinely important point about how visual pattern recognition actually works, and how easily it can mislead observers when applied loosely across radically different cultures, radically different time periods, and radically different original contexts. A rounded handle attached to a rectangular or curved body is, quite simply, an extraordinarily common, practical, functional shape for any container humans might reasonably want to carry by hand, whether that container is a bucket for water, a basket for carrying food or goods, or a bag for transporting personal belongings. This is precisely the kind of basic practical shape that different cultures, working entirely independently across vastly different time periods, entirely different continents, and entirely different artistic traditions, would be expected to converge on repeatedly and independently, simply as a natural, sensible solution to the shared practical problem of how to design a container that a person can comfortably carry by hand. Archaeologists refer to this kind of independent, unconnected convergence on similar solutions to similar practical problems as convergent cultural evolution, a well-documented, extremely common phenomenon across human history, and it represents a considerably more probable, considerably more evidence-supported explanation for these various visual similarities than proposing some kind of shared, forgotten, currently undocumented ancient global connection between civilizations that existed thousands of years and thousands of miles apart from each other, and for which no other, more directed or more substantial supporting archaeological evidence exists. It's genuinely worth being direct and specific about the individual claims involved in this broader worldwide handbag comparison, because treating them all as a single unified mystery obscures some fairly significant differences between them that matter considerably once you actually examine the specific evidence for each one. The claimed Maori handbag connection traces back to indigenous New Zealand mythology involving 3 baskets of divine knowledge, a genuinely real and culturally significant story within Maori oral tradition, but one describing metaphorical baskets of sacred wisdom brought back from a mythological spiritual journey, a symbolic narrative device considerably different in both form and meaning from a literal, physically depicted ritual water bucket, carried by a winged guardian figure in Assyrian palace art. The claimed Olmec connection points to certain Mesoamerican artistic depictions involving bag or basket-shaped objects, but these appear within an entirely separate religious and cultural framework, developed independently in Mesoamerica, with no established direct archaeological evidence of any contact whatsoever with ancient Mesopotamia, separated by an ocean, an entirely different set of religious traditions, and, crucially, by well over 1,000 years of independent cultural and artistic development. The claimed Göbekli Tepe connection is arguably the weakest of all these various comparisons, since Göbekli Tepe's carved pillars, dating back roughly 11,000 years, predate the Sumerian civilization by many thousands of years, and specialists in the site's iconography generally interpret its carved imagery as representing a considerably different symbolic and religious framework, one connected to that specific site's own distinct ritual purposes, rather than as a direct visual predecessor to the later, considerably more recent Mesopotamian ritual bucket imagery. This pattern, taking a genuine, well-documented archaeological finding, the Mesopotamian ritual bucket, and then substantially expanding it into a considerably more sweeping, considerably more sensational global mystery narrative by loosely connecting it to visually similar but contextually and historically unrelated imagery from entirely different cultures, represents a fairly common and recognizable structure found throughout a considerable amount of popular alternative history content more broadly. It's genuinely worth understanding this pattern clearly, because it helps explain why a topic that actually does have a fairly solid, well-evidenced mainstream archaeological answer continues circulating so persistently online as though it remains a completely unsolved, genuinely open mystery. The real narrower story here, a specific ritual water bucket used by protective Apkallu spirits in ceremonies associated with a sacred tree motif throughout ancient Mesopotamian religious art, is considerably less dramatic and considerably less shareable as viral internet content than the far more sweeping, considerably more sensational claim of a single, mysterious, unexplained symbol connecting supposedly unconnected ancient civilizations spread out across the entire globe. It's worth taking a moment to more fully understand the actual religious and ceremonial significance of this bucket motif within its proper, genuine Mesopotamian context, because that context is genuinely fascinating in its own right, even without any of the more sensationalized embellishment that so much online coverage tends to add to it. The Apkallu figures who carry this ritual bucket throughout Assyrian palace art were believed, within ancient Mesopotamian religious tradition, to be semi-divine sages, protective spirits closely associated with the god Ea, sometimes also referred to as Enki, the Mesopotamian god of wisdom, water, and creation. According to Mesopotamian mythological tradition, these Apkallu figures were credited with having originally brought the fundamental arts and technologies of civilization itself to early humanity, including writing, agriculture, and various essential ritual and religious practices. Within Assyrian royal palaces specifically, carved images of these protective Apkallu figures, shown performing this ritual act of watering or purifying the sacred tree using their bucket and cone-shaped implement, served an important, deliberate symbolic and religious function, representing ongoing, continuous divine protection and blessing, extended over the king and his entire royal household, a form of perpetual ritual protection permanently embedded within the very architecture of the palace itself. The specific sacred tree motif that these Apkallu figures are so consistently depicted, tending to, carries its own considerable symbolic weight within ancient Mesopotamian religious thought, generally understood by scholars specializing in this material as representing the fundamental abundance, fertility, and overall cosmic order of the entire kingdom, all of it dependent, at least symbolically, on continuous, ongoing ritual maintenance and active divine protection and care. Understood within this genuine, well-documented religious and cultural context, the so-called handbag of the gods isn't a mysterious, unexplained artifact suggesting some kind of hidden, forgotten ancient technology or evidence of secret extraterrestrial contact. It's a ritual water bucket, an object directly, meaningfully connected to one of the ancient world's most sophisticated, most symbolically rich systems of royal religious protection and cosmic ritual maintenance, an object whose meaning and function scholars have successfully reconstructed and confirmed through the genuinely careful, methodical combination of surviving physical artifacts, related surviving texts, comparative iconographic analysis conducted across a broad, well-studied body of ancient Mesopotamian art. There's a broader point worth making here, one that extends well beyond just this one specific archaeological topic. regarding how genuine scientific and archaeological uncertainty actually differs from the kind of manufactured, sensationalized mystery that circulates so widely and so persistently across social media and less rigorous corners of the internet. In authentic, legitimate archaeological research, genuine uncertainty exists constantly and reputable. Careful scholars are generally quite comfortable openly acknowledging exactly what remains unknown or actively debated within their specific field of study. But genuine scholarly uncertainty typically looks considerably different from the version of mystery that tends to circulate widely online. It usually involves carefully specified, narrowly defined questions, precise dating uncertainties regarding a particular artifact, ongoing debate over one specific detail of a broader interpretation that's otherwise well established, or open questions about certain specific aspects of ritual practice that current archaeological or textual evidence simply doesn't yet fully clarify. It essentially never involves the kind of sweeping, dramatic, unresolved global mystery framing that so much popular alternative history content tends to construct and present, particularly regarding claims of ancient global contact between civilizations for which no substantial, direct supporting archaeological evidence actually exists. The Sumerian and Assyrian ritual bucket represents a genuinely excellent, clear illustration of exactly this important distinction in practice. There's no remaining serious scholarly debate within the field of Assyriology regarding what this specific object depicted in Mesopotamian art actually is. The textual identification through the terms Dalu and Bandudu is well established and widely accepted. The connection to actual, physically surviving bronze bucket artifacts is well documented and consistently confirmed. The religious and ceremonial context involving the Apkallu figures and their consistent association with the broader sacred tree motif is thoroughly and extensively studied throughout the existing academic literature on ancient Mesopotamian religion. What remains considerably less certain, and what likely will remain permanently less certain given the current, genuinely limited state of surviving textual evidence, are some of the more specific, granular ritual details. Precisely what particular substance the bucket is meant to represent as containing within these various different depictions, whether the liquid involved was understood as plain water, some kind of specially prepared ritual substance, or a more purely symbolic representation, not meant to correspond to any single specific physical substance at all, and precisely how these particular ceremonial images related to actual real-world ritual practices that would have been physically performed within these ancient royal palaces during this specific historical period. These represent genuine, legitimate open questions actively pursued by working scholars, but they're considerably narrower, considerably more specific in scope, and considerably less sensational than the sweeping, globe-spanning ancient mystery narrative that so much popular online content continues promoting regarding this same underlying imagery. So, to directly and honestly answer the question posed at the very start of this piece, what exactly is the Sumerian and Assyrian handbag of the gods, and have scientists genuinely explained it? The honest, complete answer is genuinely yes. Archaeologists and specialists in Assyriology have provided a well-evidenced, thoroughly documented explanation for this specific object, one confirmed through the careful convergence of surviving cuneiform texts, actual physical bronze bucket artifacts recovered through archaeological excavation, and extensive comparative analysis of religious iconography across a substantial body of ancient Mesopotamian art. It is a ritual water bucket, most likely used in ceremonies specifically involving the symbolic watering or purification of the recurring sacred tree motif, carried consistently by protective, semi-divine Apkallu spirits, closely associated with the Mesopotamian god of wisdom and water. What has not been genuinely established, and what does not hold up under closer, more careful scholarly scrutiny, is the considerably more dramatic, considerably more sweeping claim that this exact same specific object appears in essentially identical form across entirely unrelated ancient civilizations spanning the globe, evidence, some have claimed, of some kind of shared, currently undocumented ancient global connection. That particular broader claim relies primarily on loose, surface-level visual pattern matching across civilizations separated by vast oceans, by many thousands of years of independent historical development, and by entirely distinct, unrelated religious and cultural traditions, a considerably weaker and less rigorous form of evidence than the genuine, multiply-corroborated, textual and archaeological confirmation that specifically supports the well-documented Mesopotamian ritual bucket identification on its own, much narrower and more specific terms. What makes this particular story genuinely worth understanding in detail isn't simply the specific archaeological answer itself, satisfying as that answer actually is once you take the time to properly understand it. It's what this story more broadly reveals about how mystery, real, manufactured, or some complicated combination of both, tends to spread and persist so effectively across the modern internet, A genuinely fascinating, well-documented piece of ancient religious symbolism, one that already carries real, substantive scholarly interest entirely on its own merits, gets transformed instead into a considerably more sensational, considerably more shareable global mystery through the process of loosely connecting it to visually similar, but historically and culturally unrelated, imagery drawn from entirely different, unconnected civilizations. The real object, an ancient Mesopotamian ritual water bucket carried by protective spirits in ceremonies dedicated to a sacred tree representing the fertility, abundance, and cosmic order of an entire royal kingdom, doesn't actually need any invented mystery or embellishment to remain genuinely interesting. It already offers a direct, tangible window into a religious and symbolic world that existed roughly 3,000 years ago, one that modern archaeological scholarship has worked carefully and methodically to understand and reconstruct, using precisely the kind of careful textual and physical evidence that a considerably more sensational, invented global mystery narrative simply doesn't require, and in this specific case, simply doesn't actually have.